The room was packed. Cameras were rolling. Senators were ready with tough questions. But no one expected what happened next. One by one, lawmakers stepped forward, prepared to challenge Pam Bondi. They had their notes, their talking points, and their strategy, yet in several unforgettable moments, the exchange flipped completely. Instead of Bondi struggling to answer questions, it was the senators who suddenly found themselves pausing, reconsidering, or even sitting in stunned silence. These weren't loud shouting matches. They were sharper than that. Moments where a single response changed the entire tone of the room. And during multiple hearings, Pam Bondi delivered replies that instantly shifted the balance of the conversation. Here are 7 moments when senators expected an easy exchange, and instead were left speechless. The exchange began like many others during the hearing, with a question that sounded simple on the surface, but carried a deeper implication underneath. A senator leaned forward, adjusting a stack of papers on the desk before speaking. The tone was calm, but the intent behind the question was unmistakable. The topic was the independence of the Justice Department. The senator asked whether political pressure could ever influence legal decisions made by the department. It was the kind of question designed to put any nominee in a difficult position. If the answer sounded too cautious, critics might say it was evasive. If it sounded too confident, opponents might accuse the nominee of ignoring the realities of politics. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone understood that this question was about more than policy. It was about trust in the legal system and the people responsible for enforcing the law. Many in the audience expected a long, carefully worded response. But Pam Bondi took a different approach. Instead of offering a complicated explanation or a lengthy legal argument, she responded with a calm and measured tone. She said that the credibility of the Justice Department rests on one simple principle: the law must apply equally to everyone. Not selectively, not politically. Equally. The words were straightforward, but the message carried weight. Rather than stopping there, Bondi continued by gently shifting the focus of the conversation. Instead of keeping the discussion centered only on the department itself, she pointed toward the broader responsibility shared by everyone involved in the system. Lawmakers, she said, also play a role in protecting the independence of the justice system. If the goal is truly an impartial Department of Justice, then the standard must remain the same no matter which political party is being investigated, criticized, or held accountable. The principle cannot change depending on who benefits from the outcome. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room subtly changed. What had begun as a pointed question aimed directly at her suddenly expanded into something larger, a reflection on the entire system. For a brief moment, the usual rhythm of the hearing slowed. Staffers who had been typing paused. Few senators shifted slightly in their chairs. Reporters in the back of the room continued watching closely, sensing that the tone of the exchange had shifted. The senator who asked the original question looked down at the notes on the desk for a few seconds. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There were no raised voices or interruptions. But the impact of the response was clear. The exchange had moved away from the initial implication of political pressure and toward a broader conversation about fairness and consistency in the law. Moments later, the senator quietly moved on to the next topic, yet the brief pause that followed Bondi's answer stood out to many observers. Because sometimes the most memorable moments in hearings don't come from heated arguments or dramatic clashes. They come from a single response that reframes the entire discussion. And in that moment, what began as a challenge directed at one person had briefly turned into a question for everyone in the room. The atmosphere in the hearing room had already been tense for much of the day. Senators had been taking turns asking questions, carefully pressing for answers, on issues ranging from legal philosophy to the role of the Justice Department in politically sensitive investigations. Then, one exchange suddenly raised the temperature in the room. A senator leaned toward the microphone and used a phrase that immediately caught everyone's attention: Department of Revenge. The words landed heavily. The accusation carried a clear implication that the Justice Department could potentially be used to target political opponents, rather than simply enforce the law. It was a serious charge, and the way it was phrased made the moment feel more dramatic than the typical back-and-forth questioning that had filled the hearing up to that point. Almost instantly, the reaction in the room changed. Reporters sitting in the back leaned forward in their chairs. Several staff members who had been quietly typing notes paused and looked up. Even some of the senators shifted their attention more closely toward the witness table. Everyone seemed to understand that the next response would matter. In moments like this, hearings can quickly spiral into heated exchanges. Sometimes voices rise, interruptions follow, and the discussion becomes more about political positioning than legal reasoning. But Pam Bondi didn't respond with frustration or defensiveness. Instead, she answered calmly, without hesitation. She addressed the phrase directly. She said the Justice Department should never be a tool for revenge against political opponents. The purpose of the department, she explained, is to enforce the law fairly and independently, based on evidence and established legal standards. Investigations, she said, must be driven by facts, not politics. Not personal grievances, not partisan advantage, just evidence and the law. Her response was measured, but she didn't stop there after making that point. Bondi added something that immediately drew even more attention in the room. She explained that the danger doesn't exist only when investigations are pursued for political reasons. There is another risk that can be just as damaging to the justice system. Ignoring credible allegations of wrongdoing simply because they involve powerful or politically connected individuals. If the legal system begins avoiding investigations out of fear of political controversy, she said, that would undermine public confidence just as much as pursuing cases for the wrong reasons. The standard, she emphasized, has to remain the same for everyone. If credible evidence exists, it must be examined. If it does not, then no investigation should move forward. The principle must be consistent. As she finished speaking, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. For a brief moment, no one interrupted. The senator who had introduced the phrase appeared to pause, considering the response before continuing the questioning. Around the room, the usual quiet activity of hearings, note-taking, whispering between aides, the occasional shuffle of papers, seemed to slow down. The conversation had moved away from the dramatic accusation and toward a deeper discussion about how justice should operate in a political environment. It wasn't a loud or explosive moment. There were no raised voices or dramatic gestures, but the effect was noticeable. What had started as a pointed political accusation had been reframed into a broader principle about fairness, evidence, and responsibility. And for a few seconds, the hearing room sat in complete silence, the kind of silence that often follows a response that shifts the entire direction of the conversation. During one of the more intense moments of the proceedings, a discussion about the courts suddenly turned into one of the most widely replayed exchanges from the hearing. Up to that point, the conversation had focused on legal interpretation and the role judges play in reviewing government actions. Senators had been asking about court rulings, constitutional limits, and how the Justice Department should respond when judges block or challenge certain policies. It was a technical discussion, the kind that often involves complex legal language and careful phrasing. Then the tone shifted slightly. While explaining her perspective on certain rulings, Pam Bondi referred to what she described as activist judges. The phrase immediately stood out. In political debates, the term is often used to criticize court decisions that some believe go beyond interpreting the law and instead reshape policy through judicial rulings. But inside a courtroom or formal legal setting, that kind of label can quickly raise concerns. Almost immediately after the phrase was spoken, the presiding judge responded. The interruption wasn't loud or emotional. In fact, it was delivered in a calm and controlled tone, but it was unmistakably firm. The judge reminded everyone in the room that courtroom arguments must focus on legal reasoning rather than labels or characterizations. The role of the court, the judge explained, is to evaluate legal arguments based on statutes, precedent, and constitutional interpretation, not political terminology. The response was brief, just a few carefully chosen words. Yet the effect was immediate. The atmosphere in the room tightened for a moment as people absorbed what had just happened. Attorneys sitting nearby glanced toward the bench. A few observers shifted in their seats. Moments like this are not unusual in legal proceedings, but they always carry a certain weight. A judge's role is not only to hear arguments, but also to maintain the tone and structure of the courtroom. When a comment crosses into territory that might distract from the legal issues at hand, judges often step in to guide the conversation back to the proper focus. For a brief moment, the tension was noticeable, but Bondi responded quickly. Rather than challenging the correction or continuing the phrase, she adjusted her wording almost immediately. She clarified that her point wasn't intended as a personal attack on the judiciary. Instead, she explained that she was referring to broader debates about how courts sometimes interpret laws in complex or controversial cases. Her argument, she said, was about legal philosophy, the ongoing discussion over how strictly courts should interpret statutes and constitutional provisions. Some judges favor a narrower, reading of the law. Others believe courts have a broader role when applying legal principles to modern issues. By reframing her statement in those terms, Bondi shifted the focus back toward the legal discussion itself. The brief moment of tension began to fade. The judge acknowledged the clarification, and the hearing moved forward. Within minutes, the conversation returned to questions about legal precedent and judicial review, as if the interruption had simply been a quick course correction. Yet observers later noted how revealing the exchange had been. It demonstrated how delicate the balance can be during legal proceedings. Attorneys often argue passionately for their positions, especially when discussing controversial court rulings, but they must also remain mindful of the language they use and the boundaries set by courtroom protocol. Even experienced legal professionals occasionally find themselves navigating that fine line. And in this case, a short correction followed by a quick adjustment was enough to reset the tone of the room and keep the focus exactly where the court expected it to be. On the law. Another striking moment unfolded when the hearing shifted toward past investigations and some of the most controversial cases discussed in recent years. Up to that point, the conversation had largely focused on policy questions and legal principles. Senators had been asking about procedures, investigative standards, and how certain decisions within the Justice Department are made. But then one senator steered the discussion toward high-profile investigations that had captured national attention. The question itself was carefully worded, touching on how complex cases involving powerful individuals are handled and how investigators determine whether certain leads should be pursued. For a moment, it seemed like just another legal inquiry. Then, Pam Bondi gave an answer that included a brief reference to connections that investigators had previously examined in relation to Jeffrey Epstein. The mention was short, just a sentence, but the effect inside the room was immediate. Everyone present understood the weight carried by that name. The Epstein case had already become one of the most widely discussed legal scandals in recent history, involving a network of allegations, investigations, and unanswered questions that had drawn attention from lawmakers, journalists, and the public. Because of that history, even a passing reference during a hearing had the potential to shift the entire tone of the discussion. The senator who had asked the question appeared to pause for a moment, instead of immediately moving to the next point. There was a brief but noticeable hesitation. Across the room, several people seemed to register the shift as well. Reporters looked up from their notes. Staff members glanced toward the witness table. Even some of the senators sitting nearby appeared to lean slightly forward, as if considering where the conversation might go next. Moments like that often happen in hearings. When a sensitive subject suddenly enters the discussion, everyone in the room knows that a single statement could open the door to a much larger line of questioning. Legal analysts later noted that even a short reference to a case like Epstein's could potentially lead to many additional avenues of inquiry. Witness testimony, previously undisclosed documents, investigative leads that may or may not have been fully explored. Each of those possibilities carries significant legal and political implications, especially when lawmakers are involved in the questioning. Yet Bondi didn't expand on the reference. Instead of diving deeper into the topic or introducing new details, she shifted the discussion back toward the broader legal framework surrounding investigations. Her response emphasized the importance of following established procedures when examining allegations, regardless of how prominent or controversial the individuals involved might be. Investigators, she explained, must rely on evidence, documented information, and the legal standards that guide every federal inquiry. The focus, she suggested, should remain on how the system works, not on speculation about any particular case. By returning the conversation to those principles, the exchange moved forward without further discussion of the reference itself. Still, the brief moment lingered. Because sometimes the most powerful statements in a hearing are not long explanations or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, they are short references, a single sentence that reminds everyone in the room of a much larger story. And, for a few seconds after that mention, the hearing room fell into an unusual quiet, as if everyone present was considering just how significant that one line might be. Perhaps the most memorable moment of the entire hearing didn't come during a heated exchange or a tense back and forth between lawmakers. Instead, it happened at the very end of the session. By that point, the hearing had already lasted for hours. Senators had taken turns asking questions, raising concerns, and pressing for detailed explanations. The tone throughout the day had shifted many times, sometimes calm and technical, other times sharp and politically charged. Stacks of documents had been shuffled across desks. Staff members had quietly passed notes back and forth. Reporters had been typing constantly, trying to capture every important moment. The pace had been relentless. But eventually, the questioning came to a close. As the session neared its end, Pam Bondi was given a few minutes to offer closing remarks, a common practice at the end of long hearings. Many people in the room likely expected her to use that time to respond to the toughest criticisms she had faced earlier in the day. After all, several senators had challenged her on sensitive issues, and the hearing had included more than a few tense exchanges. It would have been easy to revisit those moments, to push back, to restate arguments, but Bondi took a different approach. Instead of focusing on the disagreements that had filled the room for most of the day, she stepped back and addressed something broader, something that extended beyond any single policy or political debate: public trust. She began by acknowledging that disagreements between lawmakers, attorneys, and judges are a normal part of the American legal system. Debate, she said, is not only expected, but necessary when difficult legal questions are being examined. Different perspectives help test ideas, challenge assumptions, and strengthen the decisions that ultimately shape the law. But she explained that the strength of the system doesn't come only from debate, it comes from the public's belief that the system itself is fair. According to Bondi, confidence in the justice system depends on several core principles: fairness, transparency, accountability, and most importantly, the belief that the rules apply equally to everyone. Not just to some individuals, not just when it is politically convenient, but to everyone, regardless of power, position, or political affiliation. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The rapid pace that had defined the hearing for hours seemed to slow. The earlier tension, the pointed questions and quick responses, faded into something quieter. Several senators who had strongly challenged her earlier in the day listened without interruption. Some sat back in their chairs. Others looked down at their notes, reflecting on the discussion that had unfolded over the past several hours. Even the reporters in the room appeared to pause for a moment before continuing to type. There were no dramatic reactions, no raised voices. Just a calm, steady statement about the values that support the entire legal system. And sometimes, those quieter moments are the ones that resonate the most. Because while heated exchanges may capture attention in the moment, closing reflections often leave the deeper impression. Bondi finished her remarks by emphasizing that public confidence in justice is something that must be protected carefully. It requires consistent standards, open institutions, and leaders willing to apply the law fairly, even when doing so is difficult. When she finished speaking, the room remained quiet for a brief moment before the hearing formally concluded. It wasn't a dramatic ending, but it was a reminder of the principles that the entire system is built on. And sometimes, a simple reminder of those principles can be more powerful than any argument. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful courtroom moments and political hearing breakdowns. Also, share this video with friends who enjoy behind-the-scenes insights into major legal and political events. And don't forget to drop a comment below. Which moment surprised you the most? Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching.